wherever you are right now, I want you to get comfortable. If you are in bed, pull the blanket a little closer. If you are on a couch, let your body sink into it. If you have headphones on, good. Let the rest of the room disappear. And if you are driving, well, maybe save this one for tonight, because this is going to be a long, slow, beautiful ride through something you thought you already understood. And I want you to type in the comments right now, wherever you are listening from, your city, your country, your little corner of the world. And while you are at it, type any topic you want me to cover next: history, food, ancient civilizations, weird medieval habits, anything. I read them all. Well, I read most of them, the ones that are not just someone typing the same joke 17 times now. Let me ask you something simple. When did the United States begin? Go ahead, think about it for a second. Most people, without even flinching, will say 1776. July 4th, 1776, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, Philadelphia, fireworks, done, clean, comfortable. And here is where I have to gently, very gently tip that over. Because if the United States began in 1776, then what do we call the 169 years of colonial life before that? What do we call the people who were already building towns, planting crops, writing laws, and dying of smallpox on this exact same land, under a different flag, speaking the same English, worshiping in the same churches, and thinking of themselves as, well, not Americans at all? What do we call the people who were here before even those people arrived? The ones who had been living on this land for somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years, depending on which archaeologist you ask. And trust me, they do not all agree, but they all agree it was a very, very long time. So when exactly did the United States begin? And the honest answer, the one that nobody puts on a bumper sticker, is that it depends on what you mean by begin. And that question, that one quiet, uncomfortable question, is going to carry us through the next 3 hours. Because the history of the United States is not a story that starts with a document. It is a story that starts with ice, actual ice, a frozen corridor of land, where the first human beings walked into an entirely new world without knowing it was new. They were not explorers. They were not adventurers. They were people following animals, trying to eat, trying to stay warm, doing what every human being who has ever lived has done, which is simply try to survive the week. And from that moment, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, to the moment you are lying here listening to my voice tonight, every single thing that happened on this land is the history of the United States. Not just the founding fathers, not just the Civil War, not just the moon landing, all of it. Now here is something that might bother you a little, and I say this with great affection, but the version of American history that most people carry around in their heads was built in layers, and not always by historians. Sometimes it was built by politicians who needed a clean story. Sometimes by textbook companies who needed to fit everything into 300 pages. Sometimes by Hollywood, which needed a hero and a villain and exactly 2 hours to wrap things up. The real story is messier. It is slower. It is full of people making decisions that seemed completely reasonable to them at the time, and looking absolutely baffling to us now. And it is full of people we were never told about, doing things that mattered enormously, whose names never made it into the chapter headings. And that is exactly the kind of history we are going to talk about tonight. Not the parade version, not the monument version, the human version, the version where people smelled bad and made bad decisions and were terrified of things we have cures for now. The version where enormous, world-changing events happened because one person got sick at the wrong moment, or one letter arrived a day too late, or one general decided to cross a river in a snowstorm on Christmas night because he was frankly running out of options. That version. Here is the first contradiction I want to leave with you as we begin. The United States is one of the youngest countries in the world, if you measure by its founding document. 1776 is not very old. There are buildings in Europe older than the United States. There are family recipes in Asia older than the United States. There are jokes in the Middle East older than the United States, though I will not try to prove that one, but the land itself and the human story on that land is ancient. Deeply, quietly ancient, and the tension between those two things, the very new country sitting on a very old story, is something that has never fully been resolved, and maybe it never will be. So tonight we are going to start at the beginning, the real beginning, not Philadelphia in 1776, not Plymouth in 1620, not even Columbus in 1492, though we will get to all of those, I promise. We are going to start with ice and wind and people walking into the unknown. And by the time we are done, somewhere around the 3-hour mark, when your eyes are heavy and the room is quiet, I think the United States is going to feel like something different to you, not better or worse necessarily. Just more real, more human, more like a story that is still being written rather than a finished thing hanging on a wall in a museum. And one more thing before we go forward. There is a phrase that gets used a lot in American history. You have heard it, the land of the free. Beautiful phrase, genuinely beautiful. And we are going to look at that phrase tonight, the way you look at an old photograph, carefully, in good light, noticing everything in the frame, including the things just at the edges that the photographer maybe did not intend for you to see. Because that is what honest history does. It does not destroy the photograph. It just shows you the whole picture. All right, get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and that, honestly, is the point. There is a version of American history that almost everyone knows. It goes something like this. Columbus sailed in 1492, discovered America, and everything started from there. Then the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower in 1620, had a nice dinner with the Native Americans, called it Thanksgiving, and began building the country. Then the colonists got tired of paying taxes to the British king, so they wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, fought a war, won it, and George Washington became the first president. Then there was the Civil War, Lincoln freed the slaves, and America became the great nation it is today. Then 2 world wars, the moon landing, and here we are, clean, tidy, fits in a paragraph. And almost every part of that story, while not entirely wrong, is missing so much that it becomes, in a very practical sense, a different story entirely. Let us start with Columbus. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. I know you have heard that before, but let us sit with it for a moment, because it is still worth saying slowly. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, there were already somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people living in the Americas. That is a very wide range, and historians debate the exact number quite seriously, but even the lowest estimates are staggering. 50 million people, cities, trade routes, agriculture, architecture, medicine, languages, calendars more accurate than the ones Europeans were using. You cannot discover a place where 50 million people already live. What Columbus did, which was genuinely significant in its own right, was establish a permanent, sustained connection between the Eastern and Western hemispheres for the first time in recorded history. That matters enormously. That changed the world forever. But it is a very different thing from discovery. And then there is the Norse question, which the schoolbook version tends to skip entirely. The Vikings, specifically a man named Leif Erikson, reached North America around the year 1000 AD. That is nearly 500 years before Columbus. We know this not from legend, not from myth, but from archaeology. There is an actual Viking site at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, that has been carefully excavated and dated. The remains are real. The settlement happened. It just did not stick. The Norse came, spent a few winters, had some conflicts with the local populations, and left. But they were here. So, the Columbus discovered America story is wrong on 2 counts. The people were already here, and a European had already made the journey before him. Now, the Pilgrims. The Thanksgiving story is perhaps the most thoroughly romanticized piece of American history that exists. The image most people carry is of friendly pilgrims in tall black hats, sitting down with smiling Native Americans for a harmonious autumn feast, full of goodwill and mutual respect. Here is what actually happened, as best as historians can reconstruct it. In the autumn of 1621, the Plymouth colonists did share a meal with the Wampanoag people, specifically with a leader named Massasoit and around 90 of his men. This is real, it happened. But the context around it is not what the greeting cards suggest. The Pilgrims had arrived in 1620 in a land that had already been devastated by disease. In the years just before their arrival, between 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic epidemic, likely some combination of diseases brought by earlier European contact, had killed somewhere between 70 and 90% of the coastal New England native population. Entire villages had been wiped out. The land the Pilgrims settled on, the place they called Plymouth, had literally been a Wampanoag village called Patuxent before the epidemic emptied it. The Wampanoag who survived were weakened, politically vulnerable, and surrounded by rival tribes. Massasoit made a calculated alliance with the English settlers, partly for protection, not simply out of generosity, and that alliance, while real, would deteriorate badly within a generation, ending in one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial New England history, a war called King Philip's War, named after Massasoit's son Metacom, who the English called Philip. The harmonious Thanksgiving story was not really solidified into national mythology until the 19th century, when a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, the same woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, spent decades campaigning for a national Thanksgiving holiday. Abraham Lincoln officially declared it a national holiday in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, partly as an act of national unity. The warm colonial origin story was grafted onto it to give it historical weight. None of this means the meal did not happen. It did. But the meaning we have assigned to it is largely a creation of the 19th century, not the 17th. Then there is the Revolution. The popular version of the American Revolution is essentially a story of united colonists standing up bravely against a tyrannical king. Farmers with muskets, patriots all in agreement, liberty or death. The reality is considerably more complicated. Historians estimate that the colonial population was roughly divided into three groups during the Revolution. About a third were patriots who actively supported independence. About a third were loyalists who remained loyal to the British Crown. And about a third were somewhere in the middle, trying to stay out of it, survive the war, and keep their farms running. This was not a unanimous uprising. It was a civil war layered inside a revolution, and the loyalists, somewhere between 500,000 and 100,000 of whom eventually fled to Canada, Britain, and the Caribbean, are almost entirely absent from the standard telling. And then there is the question of who the revolution was actually for. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he owned over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. He knew the contradiction. He wrote about it privately. He struggled with it, or at least he said he did. But he did not resolve it. The Constitution that was written 11 years after the Declaration protected slavery explicitly, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of political representation, a clause that directly increased the political power of slaveholding states. The founding of the United States was genuinely revolutionary in many ways. The ideas it put into the world about human rights, self-governance, and liberty were powerful and real, and influenced political movements across the globe for centuries. But it was also a founding that specifically excluded enormous portions of the population from those ideals, and did so deliberately, in writing, at the very moment of its creation. That tension between the ideals written down and the reality lived by millions of people is not a footnote to American history. It is one of the central threads running through the entire story from beginning to end, and that is what we are going to follow tonight. Not the clean version, the real one, the one with all the people in it, ice, footprints, and the first Americans. Let us go back to the very beginning now. And I mean the very beginning. Not 1776, not 1492, not even 1000 AD with the Vikings. We are going back somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years to a time when the world looked genuinely different from what we know today. Different coastlines, different temperatures, different animals, a world that would be almost unrecognizable to modern eyes, and yet full of human beings who were, in every meaningful way, exactly like us. The story of how people first came to the Americas is one of the most actively debated questions in all of archaeology. And I want to be honest with you about that debate, because the honest version is actually more interesting than the tidy version. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory was something called the Clovis First model. The idea was that the first Americans came from northeastern Asia, crossing a land bridge called Beringia, that existed during the last ice age when sea levels were much lower than they are today. This land bridge connected what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. It was not a narrow little bridge like you might imagine. It was actually a vast, wide tundra landscape, potentially hundreds of miles across, with its own ecosystems and animals. The theory said that these migrants crossed Beringia and then moved south through a corridor between two massive ice sheets that covered most of what is now Canada, eventually spreading throughout North and South America. The earliest definitive evidence for these people was a particular style of stone spear point found near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s, and dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. For decades, Clovis first was essentially the official answer. The first Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago from Asia, end of story. And then archaeology started finding things that did not fit. A site in Chile called Monte Verde was excavated in the 1970s and eventually dated to around 14,600 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the Clovis timeline would even allow people to have reached South America. The site contained plant remains, wooden structures, and tools that were clearly made by human beings. It took years for the archaeological community to accept the findings because they broke the model so thoroughly, but eventually the evidence was too strong to dismiss. Then more sites appeared. A site in Oregon called Paisley Caves produced human DNA from coprolites, which is the scientific word for fossilized human waste, and I apologize for bringing that up this late at night. But history is not always glamorous. Those samples dated to around 14,300 years ago, and then in 2021, researchers announced the discovery of fossilized human footprints at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, dated to somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. If those dates are confirmed, and there is still active scientific discussion about them, they would push the first human presence in the Americas back dramatically to a time when the ice corridor theory cannot easily explain how people got there. So what does all of this mean? It means the story is more complicated than we thought. It means there may have been multiple waves of migration. It means some of the earliest Americans may have traveled not through an inland ice corridor, but along the Pacific coastline, moving by boat or on foot along ice-free coastal routes, fishing and gathering as they went. This is sometimes called the Kelp Highway theory, and while it is not fully proven, there is growing evidence that coastal migration played a significant role. What we can say with confidence is this: human beings have been in the Americas for a very long time. The exact dates are still being worked out. The routes are still being debated, but the presence is not in question. And what happened after that arrival is extraordinary. Over the following thousands of years, the descendants of those first migrants spread across two enormous continents. They adapted to every conceivable environment: Arctic tundra, tropical rainforest, high-altitude mountains, desert, grassland, coastal wetlands. They developed hundreds of distinct languages, with linguistic diversity so rich that some scholars argue the Americas had greater language variety than the rest of the world combined. They developed agriculture independently of the Old World. The domestication of maize, what we call corn, in what is now Mexico, is one of the most significant agricultural achievements in human history. Starting from a wild grass called teosinte, over thousands of years of careful selective cultivation, indigenous farmers transformed it into the highly productive crop that feeds much of the world today. Potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, peppers, squash, beans, and tobacco were all domesticated in the Americas and would eventually transform the diets and economies of the entire planet. They built cities, not small villages. Cities. Cahokia, near what is now St. Louis, Missouri, was at its peak around 1100 AD one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, larger than London at the same time. It had enormous earthen mounds, one of which, Monk's Mound, contains more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It had a planned urban layout, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated social organization. Chaco Canyon in what is now New Mexico was a regional center of the ancestral Puebloan people, featuring massive stone buildings aligned with astronomical precision, roads stretching for hundreds of miles, and evidence of trade connections reaching as far as Central America. These were not primitive people scratching out a bare existence. These were complex, accomplished civilizations. And here is the thing that I want you to hold on to as we move through this story. When European contact began in the late 15th and 16th centuries, the Americas were not an empty wilderness waiting to be filled. They were a populated, cultivated, managed landscape shaped over thousands of years by the people who lived there. The forests of New England that the first English settlers found so impressive were in many cases deliberately managed landscapes, shaped by generations of controlled burning and cultivation. The great herds of bison on the Great Plains existed in part because of the way indigenous peoples managed the grasslands. The idea of America as an empty, untamed wilderness, the idea of a pristine frontier, is one of the most persistent and most consequential myths in American history. It was used to justify taking land. It was used to deny the legitimacy of the people already living there, and it simply was not true. The land had a story before Columbus arrived, a long, rich, complicated story, and that story is the foundation on which everything else we are going to talk about tonight was built. So when we talk about the history of the United States, we are not starting with a blank page in 1776. We are starting with ice and footprints, and thousands of years of human life on a land that was never, not for a single moment, empty. When empires arrived, everything changed. Slowly then all at once. Power has a way of arriving quietly. Not always with armies, though armies came. Not always with violence, though violence followed. Sometimes power arrives first as a sail on the horizon, a shape that does not belong, something the people on the shore have never seen before and do not yet have a word for. That is how it began for the Americas, and what happened next was one of the most dramatic, most devastating, and most consequential collisions of civilizations in all of human history. And yet, for a long time, it was taught in schools as a story of discovery and progress, which tells you something important about who gets to write the history books. Let us talk about what actually happened when European power came to the Americas, and how it reshaped absolutely everything it touched. The Spanish came first, in force. After Columbus's initial voyages in the 1490s, Spain moved quickly to claim and colonize the Caribbean islands. And within a generation, they had extended their reach into the American mainland in ways that still shape the world today. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, one of the largest and most powerful civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, between 1519 and 1521. Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca Empire in South America less than a decade later. These conquests were remarkable military achievements, and they were also catastrophic human disasters on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. The Spanish brought weapons, horses, and military tactics that the indigenous populations had not encountered before. But the most powerful weapon they brought was entirely invisible and entirely unintentional: disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been geographically isolated from the diseases of Europe, Africa, and Asia for thousands of years. They had no immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, or any of the other illnesses that Europeans carried. And when those diseases arrived, the results were catastrophic in a way that no battle, no conquest, no army could match. Scholars estimate that between 1492 and 1600, the indigenous population of the Americas declined by somewhere between 50 and 90%. The range of estimates is wide because the numbers are genuinely difficult to establish, and historians debate them carefully. But even the most conservative estimates represent one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in recorded human history. Entire cultures disappeared. Languages that had been spoken for thousands of years died because everyone who knew them died. Agricultural knowledge, architectural traditions, oral histories, medical practices, astronomical observations, all of it gone in the span of a few generations. This is not a minor background detail in American history. This is the foundation on which the entire colonial project was built. The reason the eastern seaboard of North America seemed, to English colonists, to be relatively empty and available for settlement in the early 1600s was largely because epidemics had swept through years or even decades before the colonists arrived. The land had not always been so lightly populated. The colonists, in many cases, were settling on land that had been emptied by diseases their own people had unknowingly sent ahead of them now. The English, the Spanish colonized much of Central America, South America, and the southwestern and southeastern parts of North America. The French established presence in what is now Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. The Dutch had a foothold in what is now New York, and the English, arriving somewhat later, began establishing permanent colonies along the eastern coast of North America, starting in the early 1600s. The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, and Jamestown is a fascinating window into how power actually works in practice. Because Jamestown nearly collapsed completely, multiple times, and it survived for reasons that were far less heroic than the history books tend to suggest. The early Jamestown colonists were badly prepared for what they found. Many of them were gentlemen who considered manual labor beneath them. They had come expecting to find gold lying around, which they did not. They did not know how to farm in this environment. They were in a location chosen for military defensibility rather than agricultural potential, which meant the soil was poor and the water was brackish and disease-ridden. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period called the Starving Time, the population of Jamestown fell from around 500 people to somewhere between 60 and 90 survivors. The conditions were desperate enough that there is archaeological and historical evidence suggesting that some colonists resorted to eating the dead. This is not the version of early American colonial life that makes it onto the posters. What saved Jamestown, in the most immediately practical sense, was tobacco. John Rolfe, who is also remembered for marrying a Powhatan woman named Amanathas, known to most people by her childhood nickname Pocahontas, cultivated a variety of tobacco that could be sold successfully in England. By 1617, tobacco was Jamestown's primary export. By 1619, the Virginia colony was exporting large quantities of it, and tobacco, as a cash crop, required enormous amounts of labor. First, the Virginia colonists used indentured servants, mostly poor English men and women, who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. Then, in 1619, a Dutch ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying, in the words of colonist John Rolfe, 20 and odd Negroes, who had been taken from a Portuguese slave ship. These were the first documented Africans in English colonial Virginia. The system of chattel slavery, in which African people and their descendants were treated as property for life, did not appear fully formed overnight. It developed over several decades through a series of laws, economic pressures, and deliberate legal decisions. But by the mid-1600s, Virginia had established a legal framework for hereditary racial slavery. A child born to an enslaved mother was enslaved at birth, regardless of the father's status. This was a decision made by people with power in writing on purpose. It was not inevitable. It was not natural. It was chosen. And the consequences of that choice would shape American life for the next 4 centuries and are still being felt today. Meanwhile, further north, different forms of colonial power were taking shape. The New England colonies, established primarily by Puritan settlers seeking religious freedom, operated on different economic foundations than the tobacco colonies of the South. They were more focused on trade, fishing, and small-scale agriculture. They also had a relationship with indigenous peoples that followed its own particular and often brutal arc. The relationship between the English colonists and the various indigenous nations of the Northeast was never simple. It moved through periods of trade, alliance, conflict, and outright war. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 ended with the near-total destruction of the Pequot people, with hundreds killed, and many of the survivors sold into slavery in the Caribbean. King Philip's War from 1675 to 1678 was proportionally one of the deadliest wars in American history, killing a larger percentage of the New England population than any other conflict the region has experienced, before or since, on both sides. And through all of this, the colonial project was being driven by something that was not simply greed or violence, though both were present. It was being driven by a framework of ideas about land ownership, civilization, and religion that made the colonists genuinely believe, most of them, that what they were doing was justified. The doctrine of discovery, a legal and theological concept originating in 15th century papal decrees, held that Christian European explorers had the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples. This doctrine shaped colonial law and was actually cited in a United States Supreme Court decision as recently as 1823 in a case called Johnson v. Mintosh. Power does not just arrive with armies, it arrives with ideas. And the ideas that European empires brought to the Americas about land, about race, about civilization, about who counted as fully human, embedded themselves into the laws and institutions of the colonies so deeply that they are still being excavated and debated today. By the time the American Revolution began in 1775, the colonial system had been running for over 150 years. The institutions it had built, the economy based on enslaved labor, the legal frameworks around land ownership, the social hierarchies based on race and class and religion were not accidents. They were structures, built by people with power for the benefit of people with power. And the revolution that came next would challenge some of those structures and carefully preserve others. That too was a choice, and choices in history always leave fingerprints. Let us slow down for a moment. We have talked about empires and diseases and legal frameworks and the broad sweeping movements of history, and all of that matters enormously. But history is not only made of big forces and famous names. It is also made of ordinary mornings, of the smell of wood smoke before sunrise, of the weight of a water bucket carried from a well, of the sound of children coughing through a winter night while a mother sits up wondering if it is serious this time. History is made of people, and people are mostly tired. So let us spend some time here, in the daily texture of early American life. Not the heroic version, the real version, the one that smelled and ached and worried and occasionally, in spite of everything, laughed. Let us start in the colonial period, roughly the 1600s and 1700s, because this is the era that most people have some picture of in their minds, even if that picture is heavily filtered through Thanksgiving pageants and school plays. The first thing to understand about daily life in colonial America is that it was defined almost entirely by physical labor, not the kind of labor you choose, not a workout or a hobby, the kind of labor that determines whether you eat, whether your children eat, whether the roof over your head survives the next storm. A colonial household, particularly in the rural areas where most people lived, was essentially a small production facility. Everything that the family needed had to be either grown, made, or traded for locally. There were no grocery stores. There were no hardware shops in most places. If you needed cloth, someone in your household spun it and wove it. If you needed candles, someone rendered the fat and dipped the wicks. If you needed bread, someone grew the wheat, had it milled, and baked it in a fire oven that required constant attention and a level of skill that took years to develop. Women in colonial households carried a workload that is almost impossible to overstate. Cooking over an open fire was not a simple matter. It required managing multiple pots at different temperatures simultaneously, with no thermometer and no timer, using nothing but experience and judgment. Bread baking, butter churning, cheese making, soap making, candle dipping, spinning, weaving, sewing, mending, preserving food for winter, tending kitchen gardens, caring for children, nursing the sick. All of this fell primarily to women, and most colonial women were pregnant or nursing for a significant portion of their adult lives, doing all of this work while their bodies were under additional physical strain. Men worked brutally hard as well, clearing land, plowing fields, building and repairing structures, tending livestock, cutting firewood, which a colonial family might consume in quantities that required weeks of work to accumulate. But the division of labor was rigid and largely invisible in the historical record, because women's work was considered domestic and therefore unremarkable, while men's work was considered economic and therefore worth recording. Let us talk about food for a moment, because food is one of the most honest windows into how people actually lived. The colonial diet varied significantly by region and by class, but for most ordinary people, it was heavy on grains, especially corn in the early period, supplemented by whatever could be grown in a kitchen garden: beans, squash, turnips, onions, cabbages. Salt pork was a staple, because salt was one of the most reliable ways to preserve meat through a winter. Fresh vegetables were largely a warm weather luxury. By February, most families were living on whatever had been dried, salted, pickled, or stored in a root cellar. The bread was dark and dense. The porridge was thick. The stew was perpetually on the fire, added to and subtracted from day after day, a kind of culinary palimpsest that food historians find fascinating and that modern food safety regulations would find deeply concerning. Meat was more available than in contemporary Europe, which was one of the genuine advantages of colonial life for ordinary settlers. Wild game was abundant, at least in the early period. Deer, turkey, and various waterfowl supplemented the domestic pigs and chickens that most families kept. Fish was plentiful near the coast and along the rivers, but preserving that food was the challenge. Without refrigeration, the risk of spoilage was constant, and foodborne illness was a regular feature of life. Now let us talk about sleep, since that is what you are doing right now, or trying to, and since sleep in early America was genuinely different from what you experience tonight. The idea of sleeping through the night, all in one continuous block from roughly 10 at night to 6 in the morning, is actually a relatively modern concept. Historian Roger Eckerch, in his meticulous research published in the early 2000s, found extensive evidence that before the industrial era, and certainly in the colonial period, people commonly slept in two separate phases. They would sleep for several hours after dark, then wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, a period sometimes called the watch or the quiet hours, and then sleep again until morning. During that middle-of-the-night waking period, people would pray, talk quietly with a bed partner, think, sometimes visit neighbors, or simply lie in a half-dreaming state that contemporaries described in terms that sound almost meditative. It was not considered insomnia. It was considered normal. It was part of the rhythm of the night. This changes somewhat when you realize that colonial bedrooms, for those who had them, were very different from what we imagine. Most ordinary families slept in a single room or in a house with very little separation between living and sleeping spaces. The fire had to be managed through the night. Children had to be checked. Animals kept indoors for warmth in winter required attention. The night was not a sealed-off private sanctuary. It was part of the ongoing work of surviving. Beds, when people had them, were often shared, not just by married couples, but by children, by extended family members, by travelers and guests in a culture where hospitality required offering what little space you had. Bed sharing was not considered strange or intimate in the modern sense. It was practical. Bodies generate heat. Heat was survival. The bedding itself was precious. A good feather mattress was a significant household asset. Many people slept on straw mattresses or simple wooden frames strung with rope. The rope would sag over time, requiring regular retightening, which is the origin of the old phrase sleep tight. Now, illness. This is where daily life in early America becomes genuinely sobering, and I want to talk about it calmly and honestly, without making it feel dramatic, because the people who lived through it did not experience it as dramatic. They experienced it as normal, which is itself remarkable. Child mortality in the colonial period was staggering by modern standards. In some regions and time periods, as many as 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 children did not survive to their 5th birthday. Parents loved their children with the same intensity that parents today love theirs. But they also lived with a constant background awareness that any illness could turn fatal, that any winter could be the one that took someone they loved. Smallpox was the great terror of the colonial period. It swept through communities in waves, killing some and leaving others disfigured and immune. The wealthy could sometimes flee to healthier locations during outbreaks. The poor could not. Inoculation, a predecessor to vaccination involving introducing material from a mild smallpox case into a healthy person, was introduced to the American colonies in the early 1700s. Famously during a Boston epidemic in 1721, when a minister named Cotton Mather and a doctor named Zabdiel Boylston promoted the technique against fierce public opposition. People threw a bomb through Mather's window. They were that afraid of the new method, even though it worked. Malaria was endemic in the warmer and wetter parts of the colonial South and mid-Atlantic regions. Yellow fever swept through port cities periodically, killing thousands. Dysentery, typhoid, and tuberculosis were constant companions of colonial life. Childbirth killed women at rates that are difficult to comprehend today. A woman in colonial America might have 8, 10, or 12 pregnancies and lose several children and face her own mortality with each birth. And yet, and this is the part that I find quietly remarkable, people laughed, people danced, communities gathered for barn raisings and corn husking bees and election day celebrations that turned into raucous parties. People courted and fell in love and wrote surprisingly tender letters to each other. They told jokes, some of which were frankly not very different from jokes people tell today. They argued about religion and politics and their neighbor's business, with the same mixture of passion and pettiness that has characterized human community in every era. The historical record is full of small human moments that cross the centuries with startling immediacy. A Virginia planter complaining about a lazy overseer in terms that sound like a modern workplace complaint. A New England housewife noting in her diary the satisfaction of a particularly good batch of preserved plums. A young man in Philadelphia writing to his father that the city is full of temptations and that he is doing his best. These people were not characters in a historical drama. They were people, tired, worried, hopeful, funny, petty, loving, afraid, and trying, as all people in all times have tried, to make their lives feel like something worth living. That is the foundation of everything that comes next. Not the documents, not the battles, the people, always underneath everything, the people. If you wanted to choose one single object that defined early American life more than any other, you could make a very strong argument for the axe. Not a musket, not a plow, though the plow will get its moment. Not a Bible, though the Bible was everywhere. The axe, because before you could farm, you had to clear the land. Before you could build a house, you had to fell the trees. Before you could plant a field, you had to pull the stumps. And in a landscape covered by one of the densest and most extensive forests in the temperate world, the axe was the tool that made everything else possible. Think about what colonial settlement actually looked like on the ground. A family arrived somewhere along the edge of the established settlements, perhaps in the western reaches of Virginia or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts in the 18th century. They have a small amount of money, or a land grant, or simply a desperate need for fresh land because the older, established areas are too expensive or too crowded or too complicated by existing social hierarchies. They find a patch of forest. They begin to cut. Clearing 1 acre of mature eastern North American forest was an enormous undertaking. Some estimates suggest that a single man, working steadily, might clear 2 or 3 acres in a year. A family working together could do more, but the work was relentless and physically punishing in ways that are hard to imagine from the other side of the Industrial Revolution. The axe they used was not a delicate tool. The American felling axe, which evolved over the colonial period into a distinctive shape quite different from its European ancestors, was a heavy, well-balanced instrument designed for exactly this work. Blacksmiths in colonial America made axes. Colonists traded for axes. Men cared for their axes the way a modern person might care for a particularly good tool, sharpening them, keeping them dry, repairing handles, passing them down to children. There is something quietly profound about an axe as a historical object. It is a tool that contains within it a theory of the land. The European and colonial American relationship to forested land was fundamentally transformative. The forest was something to be cleared, converted, tamed, turned into productive agricultural land. This was not the only possible relationship with forest. The indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands had a very different relationship with the same trees, one based on managed coexistence rather than removal. But the axe and the worldview it represented, one. By the early 19th century, vast sections of the eastern United States that had been dense forest when Europeans arrived were open farmland. The transformation happened within a few generations, and was so complete that later Americans would sometimes have no idea that the rolling, agricultural landscape they grew up in had been something entirely different within living memory. Now let us talk about the plow. If the axe cleared the land, the plow was the instrument of its conversion into food production, and the history of the plow in America is a history of constant adaptation and improvement driven by the specific challenges of American soils. The wooden plows that early colonists brought from England worked tolerably well in the light soils of New England, but struggled in the heavier, stickier soils of the mid-Atlantic and southern regions. Iron-tipped plows were better but still imperfect. The real breakthrough came in 1837, when a young blacksmith in Grand Detour, Illinois, named John Deere, who you may have heard of in a slightly different context, designed a plow with a highly polished steel mold board that could cut through the thick, root-heavy prairie soils of the American Midwest without clogging. This was not a small improvement. It was transformative. The prairie soils of the Midwest are among the most fertile in the world, but they had resisted cultivation with existing tools. The steel plow opened them up. Within a generation, the prairies were being converted to farmland at a pace that made even the eastern deforestation look modest. And with that conversion came the displacement of the great bison herds, the destruction of the prairie ecosystem, and the final removal of the plains' indigenous nations from their traditional territories. One object, one design improvement, cascading consequences across an entire continent. But the object I want to spend the most time with in this chapter is something you might not expect: a document, specifically the Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1788. Now, a document is not usually thought of as an object in the same way that an axe or a plow is, but the physical Constitution, the actual parchment pages written out in the careful hand of a man named Jacob Shallis, a Pennsylvania assembly clerk who was paid $30 for the work, is a remarkable artifact. And tracking its meaning across centuries is one of the most illuminating things you can do to understand how America thinks about itself. The Constitution was not universally celebrated when it was written. It was controversial. It required a fierce political battle to ratify, with supporters calling themselves Federalists and opponents, called Anti-Federalists, raising serious concerns about the concentration of power it created and the absence of explicit protections for individual rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was added in 1791, precisely because the opposition had a point. The original document had no explicit protections for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, or any of the other rights that Americans today most closely associate with their founding ideals. The Constitution has been amended 27 times. Some of those amendments corrected enormous wrongs. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the vote based on race. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920, which means American women have had the constitutional right to vote for just over 100 years. Put another way, there are people alive today whose grandmothers were born before women could vote in the United States. The document itself, the original parchment, is housed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in a case filled with argon gas to preserve it. It is yellowed and partially faded. Some sections are difficult to read. It is, in physical terms, a fragile old piece of paper, but the ideas written on it have been fought over, interpreted, reinterpreted, stretched, constrained, celebrated, and condemned for over 200 years. Courts have spent centuries arguing about what specific words in it mean. Wars have been fought over competing interpretations of its clauses. Movements for justice have invoked it. Movements opposing justice have also invoked it. The Constitution is a document that contains multitudes, partly because it was written by people who disagreed with each other, compromised with each other, and left enough ambiguity that future generations would have to keep working out what it meant. In that sense, it is a very human document, not a perfect blueprint handed down from a perfect moment. A complicated agreement between complicated people with all the limitations and contradictions that implies. And it has survived for over 2 centuries, which tells you something about the strange durability of written words, especially the ones people never stop arguing about: who America was built for and who did the building. There is a phrase that appears in the preamble to the Constitution that I want to look at very carefully. We the people, 3 words, simple, declarative, powerful. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. When those words were written in 1787, We the people referred, in practical legal terms, to a fairly specific group of human beings. Propertied white men. Not all white men. Propertied ones. Men who owned land or had sufficient wealth to be considered stakeholders in the new nation. Political life. Women were excluded from political participation almost entirely. Free black men, who existed in the northern states in significant numbers, were in most places denied the right to vote or hold office. Enslaved black people, who made up roughly 1/5 of the entire population of the new United States, were counted in the census but had no political rights whatsoever. Native Americans were explicitly excluded from citizenship. Poor, white men without property faced various restrictions in many states. This is not a cynical reading of American history. It is simply accurate, and it matters enormously, because understanding who was included and who was excluded from the beginning tells you a great deal about the shape of the conflicts that followed. Let us talk about those divisions more carefully, because they operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and they touched every aspect of daily life. Class. Colonial and early American society was not the classless egalitarian society that the founding mythology sometimes suggests. It was a deeply stratified world in which birth, property, family connections, and education determined almost everything about a person's life prospects. At the top of colonial Virginia society, for example, sat the great planter families, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lees, the Byrds. These families owned enormous plantations, hundreds and sometimes thousands of acres, worked by large numbers of enslaved people. They sat on the colonial legislature, they served as judges, they commanded the local militia. They set the social tone. Their houses were large and well furnished. Their children were educated, sometimes in England. Their wives wore imported fabric and hosted elaborate social gatherings. Below them were the middling sorts, small farmers who owned their own land, skilled craftsmen, merchants, tavern keepers, ministers. These people were respectable and had some social standing and some political participation, but they lived in a fundamentally different world from the great planter elite, even if they aspired to rise. Below them were tenant farmers, indentured servants working out their contracts, landless laborers, and the very poor. And below all of them, in a legal category that placed them entirely outside the protections of society, were the enslaved now, slavery. I want to talk about slavery not as an abstraction or a distant historical fact, but as a system that shaped every aspect of daily life in a significant portion of the country for over 2 centuries. By 1790, when the first federal census was taken, there were nearly 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, that number had grown to nearly 4 million. 4 million human beings who were legally classified as property, who could be bought and sold, whose marriages had no legal standing, whose children could be taken from them and sold to another owner, who could be physically punished without legal recourse, who were denied literacy in most of the slave-holding states, because the ability to read and write was correctly understood by slaveholders as a threat to the system, and this system was not confined to the South in the way that the standard historical narrative sometimes implies. Northern merchants profited from the slave trade and from the sale of goods produced by enslaved labor. Northern insurance companies insured slave ships. Northern textile mills processed the cotton that enslaved people in the South grew and harvested. The economy of the entire early United States was intertwined with slavery in ways that are still being fully mapped by historians. The lives of enslaved people were shaped by constant surveillance, constant threat, and constant work. The hours were long, and the conditions varied depending on the crop and the region, and the particular cruelty or relative restraint of the individual enslaver, but the fundamental condition was the same everywhere. A person had been reduced to property and was treated accordingly. And yet, within those brutal constraints, enslaved people created community, culture, family bonds, spiritual life, and resistance. They preserved African linguistic and cultural traditions in the specific rhythms of the spirituals they sang, in the foodways they maintained, in the stories they told. They resisted in ways both dramatic and quiet, running away, slowing their work, feigning illness, protecting each other, and sometimes at enormous personal risk, openly revolting. Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, Nat Turner in 1831. These rebellions were suppressed with horrifying violence, but their existence terrified slaveholders and demonstrated that the system rested not on the contentment of the enslaved, but on constant, enforced, violent control. Now let us talk about women. The social position of women in early America was defined almost entirely by their relationship to men. A single woman had some legal standing to own property and enter contracts. A married woman, under the legal doctrine of coverture, had virtually none. Her legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not file lawsuits. Her wages, if she worked, belonged legally to her husband. This was not a minor inconvenience. It shaped the entire texture of women's lives. A woman who married badly, who found herself with a cruel or financially incompetent husband, had essentially no legal exit. Divorce was possible in some colonies and later some states, but it was rare, expensive, and carried enormous social stigma. The alternative to a bad marriage was often something worse. And yet here too, within these constraints, women found ways to exercise agency, influence, and power. They managed complex household economies, they educated children, they formed networks of communication and mutual support. Some, like Abigail Adams, who famously told her husband John to remember the ladies while he was helping draft the new nation's laws, articulated the contradiction between the ideals of liberty and the reality of women's exclusion with striking clarity. John Adams wrote back to Abigail that he could not help but laugh at her extraordinary claim to power, which is either charming or infuriating depending on your disposition. Then there is the question of class within the free white population, and particularly the tension between the wealthy elite and the laboring poor that erupted periodically in ways that the founding mythology tends to smooth over. Bacon's rebellion in Virginia in 1676, nearly 100 years before the Revolution, was a violent uprising in which a coalition of poor white farmers and African laborers, both free and enslaved, took up arms against the colonial government. The grievances were complex but included elite control of land and trade, the exclusion of poorer settlers from political power, and frustration over the government's handling of conflicts with Native American groups on the Plymouth frontier. The rebellion was suppressed and its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, died of illness before he could be executed, but it left a deep impression on Virginia's elite. Historians have argued that one significant consequence of Bacon's rebellion was a deliberate effort by the planter class to solidify racial categories in law, creating a clearer legal distinction between white servants and black enslaved people, partly as a strategy to prevent future cross-racial alliances among the laboring poor. If that argument is correct, and it is a mainstream scholarly position, then American racism was not simply a product of ignorance or prejudice. It was also partly a political strategy by people with power to prevent poor people of different backgrounds from recognizing their shared interests. That is a sobering thing to sit with. And it raises a question that runs all the way through American history to the present day. When people who might otherwise work together are divided by categories of race or religion or origin, who benefits from that division? The answer, across most of American history, has been remarkably consistent: those who already hold power. That is not a comfortable truth, but it is an important one. And one of the things that makes American history genuinely fascinating, genuinely moving, is that in spite of all of those divisions and all of that deliberate stratification, people kept reaching across them. Abolitionists, white and black, working together. Labor organizers crossing ethnic lines. Suffragists insisting that liberty meant what it said. Civil rights marchers demanding that the founding documents mean what they claim to mean. The social divide has always been real, and the struggle against it has always been real too. Both things, together, are the story. The revolution was not what you think it was. All right. This is the chapter where I get to tell you something that might genuinely surprise you. Something that sits quietly underneath the standard story of the American Revolution and changes the way the whole thing looks once you see it. And I want to be clear that what I am about to share is not fringe history. This is not a controversial revisionist theory cooked up to upset people. This is mainstream scholarship. The kind that historians have been discussing and refining for decades. The kind that does not make it into the textbooks as often as it should because it complicates the clean heroic narrative considerably. Here it is. The American Revolution was not primarily a revolution about liberty. It was primarily a revolution about power. Specifically, about who would hold power over a rapidly growing and increasingly wealthy colonial society, and many of the people who led it were not fighting to create a more equal world. They were fighting to protect and expand the privileges they already had. Now, before you sit up in bed to argue with me, let me be careful here, because I am not saying the ideals were fake. I am not saying liberty and self-governance were meaningless words. The ideas that the revolution put into the world were genuinely powerful and genuinely consequential. They inspired real movements for real freedom across the world for centuries afterward. What I am saying is that the people who wrote those words and led that revolution were operating within a specific set of interests that shaped which liberties they were talking about and whose freedom they were actually concerned with. Let us look at the specific grievances that drove the revolution because they are revealing. The standard story is taxes. No taxation without representation. The British Parliament was taxing the colonies without giving them seats in Parliament, and the colonists resisted because they believed in the principle of representative government. That principle was real, but the taxes themselves were actually quite modest by contemporary standards. The Stamp Act of 1765, which triggered enormous colonial outrage, taxed legal documents, newspapers, and certain other paper goods. The tax rates were lower than comparable taxes in Britain itself. The Tea Act of 1773, which led to the Boston Tea Party, actually made tea cheaper for colonists, not more expensive, by eliminating the middlemen and giving the East India Company a direct sales monopoly. The Boston Tea Party, by the way, was not a spontaneous uprising of ordinary citizens fed up with paying too much for their morning cup. It was an organized action carried out by a well-connected group of colonial merchants and activists, many of them members of a political organization called the Sons of Liberty, who were at least partly motivated by the fact that the cheaper East India Company tea was undercutting the market for smuggled Dutch tea that some of them were profiting from quite handsomely. History is often like that. The noble principle and the financial interest traveling together, each making the other look better. But here is the deeper misconception that I really want to address. There is a school of historical thought, developed most prominently by historians like Bernard Bailyn, Gordon Wood, and more recently expanded and challenged by scholars like Gary Nash and Woody Holton, that argues the American Revolution was in significant part a conservative revolution. A revolution led by elites, for the benefit of elites, dressed in the language of universal liberty. The evidence for this view is substantial. Consider who actually led the revolution. George Washington was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, owning hundreds of enslaved people and vast landholdings. Thomas Jefferson was as a wealthy planter and slaveholder. John Hancock, whose signature is the largest on the Declaration of Independence, was one of the richest merchants in New England, much of whose wealth came from, among other things, smuggling. Benjamin Franklin was wealthy, prominent, and socially established. Alexander Hamilton, perhaps the least wealthy of the prominent founders, was deeply committed to the interests of merchants and financial elites. These were not ordinary farmers taking up arms against oppression. They were the colonial elite, and they were increasingly frustrated by British imperial policies that threatened their economic autonomy and their political authority. Now here is something that rarely gets discussed in the standard telling. One of the significant motivating factors for some colonial leaders, particularly in the South, was a very specific fear about British policy towards slavery. In November 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person who escaped from a patriot master and joined the British forces. This was not a humanitarian gesture. Dunmore was doing it to destabilize the colonial economy and undermine the patriot cause. But the effect was real. Thousands of enslaved people ran to the British lines seeking freedom. By some estimates, as many as 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved people escaped, fled, or were liberated during the course of the Revolutionary War. The Dunmore Proclamation terrified Virginia planters. Here was the British Crown, threatening the entire system of enslaved labor on which their wealth and power depended. And this, historians like Holton have argued, was a significant accelerant to Southern commitment to independence. If staying British meant the potential destabilization of slavery, then independence became considerably more attractive. This does not mean the Revolution was only about protecting slavery. It was not. The causes were multiple and genuinely complex. But the protection of the slaveholding economy was one of those causes, and it is one that the standard narrative tends to leave in the margins. There is also the question of what the Revolution meant for indigenous peoples. The British, by the time of the Revolution, had issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was partly to reduce conflicts with Native American nations, and partly to manage the colonial frontier more effectively. Many colonists resented this proclamation enormously because it blocked westward expansion onto land they wanted. Independence from Britain meant independence from that restriction. And indeed, within years of the Revolution's end, the new United States began an aggressive westward expansion into territories that the proclamation had nominally protected. For Native American nations, the American Revolution was not a story of liberation. It was, in many cases, the beginning of a new and more aggressive phase of dispossession. So what does all of this mean for how we understand the Revolution? It means it was a genuinely complicated event, driven by a mixture of real principle and real self-interest, that produced something remarkable and something deeply flawed at the same time. The ideals it articulated were more universal than the intentions of everyone who articulated them. And those ideals, once written down and placed into the world, took on a life of their own that their authors could not fully control. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former enslaved man, gave a famous speech in 1852 called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?", in which he argued that the founding ideals were genuine and that it was the distance between those ideals and the reality of slavery that was the great American crime. He was not rejecting the Revolution. He was holding it to its own standard. That tension between the promise and the reality, between what was written and what was lived, is not a reason to dismiss American history. It is the engine of American history. The Revolution was real. The freedom it created was real for those it included. The freedom it denied was also real, and the argument about which is more true has been going on, with remarkable intensity, for nearly 250 years. And that argument, more than any battle or any document, is the American story. The rhythms that held America together, and the ones that tore it apart. Every society has its rituals. Not just religious ones, though those matter. The daily rituals, the seasonal ones, the ones that mark the passage of time and tell a community who it is and where it belongs in the world. The ones that are performed so regularly and so automatically that people stop noticing them as rituals at all and simply experience them as the way things are. America has always been full of these rhythms, and tracing them through history is one of the quietest and most revealing ways to understand how a society actually holds itself together. Let us start with the church. For most of American history, the rhythms of the week were organized around Sunday. Not universally, and not for everyone, but for the dominant Protestant culture that shaped so much of early American life, Sunday was the axis of the week. Everything else oriented itself around it. Sunday in colonial New England was a serious affair. The Puritan tradition that shaped the Massachusetts Bay Colony took the Sabbath extremely seriously, by which I mean they passed laws about it. You were not supposed to work, cook, play, travel unnecessarily, or engage in any activity that could be considered worldly entertainment. The Sabbath laws, called Blue Laws in later American history, varied by colony and by region, but in the strictest communities, they were genuinely comprehensive. You went to church, you stayed home, you read scripture, and you thought about your soul, which the Puritan tradition gave you quite a lot of material to work with. most of it uncomfortable. The meeting house, the plain, unadorned building at the center of the New England town, was not just a place of worship. It was the physical and social center of the community. Town meetings happened there. Important announcements were made there. The social order was literally reflected in the seating arrangements, with the most prominent families in the best seats and everyone else arranged according to their status and their ability to pay for a pew. Further south, the Anglican tradition that dominated Virginia and the Chesapeake region had its own rhythms, somewhat less austere but still deeply rooted in the liturgical calendar. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the great seasonal markers of the Christian year, structured time in ways that reached into every aspect of life. And here is something interesting about the way seasonal ritual worked in early America. The rhythms of the church calendar and the rhythms of the agricultural year were deeply intertwined. The spring planting season coincided with Easter. The autumn harvest coincided with Thanksgiving observances that predate the specific pilgrim story by a long way. The winter solstice period, which the Christian tradition had absorbed and reframed as Christmas, coincided with the natural period when agricultural work slowed and community gathering became both possible and necessary. These were not accidental alignments. They reflected thousands of years of human experience organizing communal life around the cycle of the natural world, and they gave ordinary life a structure, a sense of movement and return, that modern life organized around electric light and industrial schedules has largely lost. Now let us talk about a ritual that is distinctly American and whose origins are considerably stranger than most people realize. The 4th of July, the celebration of American independence on July 4th, is now so deeply embedded in the culture that it feels as natural as breathing. But in the early years of the Republic, it was a contested and evolving practice. The first public celebrations of independence in 1777 included bonfires, cannon fire, and the ringing of church bells. Philadelphia held a dinner for the military officers. There were toasts, there were speeches, there was considerable drinking, which has remained a feature of the holiday to the present day. But the 4th of July as a national holiday, as a shared ritual with standardized elements, developed over decades, and it was fought over. In the early 19th century, the 4th of July was used as an occasion for competing political visions of what America was and should be. Federalists held their celebrations emphasizing order, hierarchy, and the importance of strong government. Democratic Republicans held theirs emphasizing popular sovereignty and the rights of ordinary citizens. The same holiday, the same date, two entirely different ceremonies expressing two entirely different ideas about what the Revolution had meant. Abolitionists used the 4th of July as a platform for demanding that the ideals of the Declaration be extended to enslaved people. Frederick Douglass gave his famous speech on July 5, 1852, the day after the holiday, deliberately positioning himself outside the celebration to make his point. The holiday was, for him, simultaneously the most powerful argument for abolition and the most damning evidence of American hypocrisy. This is what happens to rituals over time. They accumulate meaning, they become contested. They are filled and refilled with new content by each generation. The form stays the same, the fireworks, the speeches, the gathering, but the meaning inside the form shifts and argues with itself. Let us talk about another distinctly American ritual that has a fascinating and complicated history: the town hall meeting. The idea that ordinary citizens can gather together to make decisions about their shared life is one of the foundational rituals of American democratic culture. The New England town meeting, in which all adult male property owners of a town could gather to vote on local matters, is often held up as the purest expression of grassroots democracy in American history. And in some ways, it was remarkable. Ordinary farmers sitting in the same room as wealthy merchants, voting on roads and taxes and the management of the commons. But the town meeting also had its exclusions built in. Women did not vote in town meetings. Servants did not vote. Enslaved people obviously did not vote. And even among the eligible men, the social pressures of a small community where everyone knew everyone else meant that genuinely independent voting was sometimes difficult. The prominent men of the town had influence that went well beyond their single vote. Still, the ritual of the gathering, the sense that the community has a voice in its own governance. That ordinary people have the right to stand up and speak their mind in a public forum is a genuinely powerful idea, and it has persisted in American culture in ways that still show up today in school board meetings, in city council hearings, in town halls hosted by elected officials, in the deeply American instinct that authority should be answerable to the people it governs. Let us slow down now and talk about one more American ritual, one that is quieter and more personal, but perhaps more revealing than any of the others. The practice of moving on. If there is one behavioral ritual that has defined the American experience more than any other, it might be the willingness, even the eagerness, to leave and start over somewhere new. The decision to pull up roots, abandon what is familiar and difficult, and head towards something unknown in the hope that it will be better. This pattern is present from the very beginning. The original colonists left Europe for an unknown continent. The settlers of New England moved into the interior when the coastal settlements became crowded. The post-revolutionary generation pushed across the Appalachians. The 19th century saw migration upon migration, westward across the continent, northward from the south, across the ocean from Europe and Asia. The ritual of leaving is baked into the American identity in a way that is both genuinely inspiring and quietly melancholy. Inspiring because it reflects a belief that things can be better, that a person is not trapped by where they started, that the future is open. Melancholy because every departure is also an abandonment of family, of community, of the graves of the people you loved, the covered wagon moving west across the prairie, the sharecropper family loading everything they own into a car and heading north during the Great Migration, the immigrant family on a ship watching a familiar coastline disappear, the young person from a small town packing a bag for a city they have never seen. These are all the same ritual, repeated across centuries, in different costumes and different landscapes, expressing the same fundamental human hope. That somewhere ahead, things will be different, that the next place will be the right place, that the moving itself is the answer, and whether that hope has been vindicated or disappointed has varied enormously depending on who was moving, why, and what they found when they arrived. But the ritual persists because hope, it turns out, is one of the most durable things human beings have ever made. What American bodies endured and what they were asked to carry. Let us talk about the body, not in an abstract way, in a specific, honest, grounded way, because so much of history gets told from the neck up. Ideas, arguments, decisions, philosophies, the movements of great minds through time. But history is also lived from the neck down, in muscles and lungs and stomachs and skin, in the experience of cold and heat, and hunger and pain and exhaustion and fear. And American history, from its earliest days to its most recent chapters, is a story that was lived in bodies in particular conditions, doing particular kinds of work and enduring particular kinds of hardship. And the distribution of that hardship was not random. It followed the same lines of race and class and gender that shaped everything else. Let us start with cold. The winters of early America were serious business in a way that is genuinely difficult to appreciate from the other side of central heating. The Little Ice Age, a period of slightly cooler global temperatures that lasted roughly from the 1300s to the mid-1800s, meant that winters in the colonial period were generally colder and longer than what we experience today. The winter of 1780 was so cold that New York Harbor froze solid enough for British soldiers to drag artillery across the ice from Staten Island to Manhattan. For ordinary people, winter meant a constant background battle against cold. A colonial house with a fireplace at one end was warm near the fire and genuinely frigid at the other end. Getting out of bed in the morning in a house where the temperature had dropped overnight was an act of real will. Washing was less frequent in winter, partly because heating enough water to wash was a significant undertaking and partly because exposing wet skin to cold air was genuinely dangerous. Frostbite was a real and regular hazard for people who worked outdoors, farmers and woodcutters and soldiers, and anyone who could not afford to simply stay by the fire faced it regularly. The standard colonial response to frostbitten extremities, rubbing them with snow, is now understood to be harmful rather than helpful. but the people doing it believed they were helping, which is a useful reminder that caring and knowing are not always the same thing. Now let us talk about hunger. Not the mild background hunger of a person who has skipped lunch. The kind of hunger that changes how you think and move and dream. The kind that is always present in lean times and becomes acute in bad ones. Food security in early America was precarious for most people in ways that are hard to fully appreciate. A bad harvest did not mean a trip to the grocery store for something different. It meant a genuinely difficult winter. It meant reducing portions. It meant eating the seed grain that was supposed to be saved for next spring's planting. It meant that children were the first to show the physical signs of inadequate nutrition. The Great Hunger of 1696 to 1698, which affected parts of New England alongside a broader Atlantic world crisis, is not well remembered in American historical memory, but it was real. And similar localized food crises occurred throughout the colonial period, particularly in early years of new settlements before agricultural systems were established. For enslaved people, hunger was a tool of control as well as a constant reality. Enslaved workers were given food rations by their enslavers, and those rations were calculated to maintain working capacity, not to support human flourishing. The diet was typically monotonous and nutritionally limited. Enslaved people supplemented it by keeping small gardens where they were permitted, by fishing and trapping when possible, and by sharing food within the community in ways that represented both survival strategy and cultural solidarity. Let us talk about illness now, because illness and the fear of illness shaped American life in ways that go far beyond the medical. We have already touched on smallpox. But let me give you a sense of the broader landscape of disease that early Americans navigated as a matter of daily life. Tuberculosis, called consumption in the 19th century, because it seemed to consume the body from within, was the leading cause of death in the United States for much of the 1800s. It killed 1 in 7 people who lived during that period. It killed young people disproportionately, which gave it a particular cultural weight. The romanticized image of the pale, ethereal, artistic person slowly fading away, which shows up so often in 19th century literature and painting, was partly a cultural attempt to make meaning out of an illness that was everywhere and that no one understood or could prevent. Cholera arrived in epidemic waves in the 19th century, traveling along trade routes and waterways, killing with terrifying speed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. The 1832 cholera epidemic killed thousands in American cities. The 1849 epidemic was even worse. And because cholera spread through contaminated water, it hit the poor far harder than the wealthy, who had better access to clean water and the resources to flee infected areas. Yellow fever periodically devastated port cities. The 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic killed roughly 10% of the city's population in a matter of months. Philadelphia was the capital of the United States at the time. The federal government essentially collapsed and fled. George Washington left. John Adams left. The people who stayed were largely those who could not afford to go anywhere else. And then there is childbirth. I want to talk about this carefully, because it is one of the most significant and most under-acknowledged features of the physical experience of American life for women across most of the country's history. Maternal mortality in the colonial and early national period was real and significant. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that somewhere between 1% and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death, which does not sound enormous until you consider that most women had many pregnancies. A woman who had 8 or 10 children faced that risk 8 or 10 times. The cumulative probability of dying in childbirth over a reproductive lifetime was substantial, and the deaths were not clean or peaceful. The most common causes were infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor, none of which were well understood medically, and none of which could be reliably treated. The transition from midwife-attended births, which relied on generations of practical knowledge, to physician-attended births in the 19th century was not initially an improvement in outcomes. Physicians in the early 19th century had not yet understood the germ theory of disease, and sometimes moved directly from handling corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. spreading the very infections they were supposed to prevent. Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who figured out that hand-washing dramatically reduced maternal death rates, was largely dismissed by the medical establishment of his time. The knowledge existed before it was accepted, which is a pattern that repeats throughout medical history, with a regularity that is either darkly funny or simply dark, depending on your mood. Now let us talk about labor, the physical labor of building a country. The canals that connected the interior of the early United States to the coast, the Erie Canal being the most famous, were dug by hand, by men with shovels and pickaxes and wheelbarrows, working in conditions that were frequently dangerous. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. It was built over about 8 years by a workforce that included large numbers of Irish immigrants, many of whom were living in poverty and working for wages that barely covered food and shelter. Malaria, dysentery, and accidents killed workers throughout the construction. The railroads that followed the canals were built the same way. Enormous quantities of human physical effort, organized and directed by capital, extracting maximum work for minimum compensation from men who had few alternatives. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was built largely by Chinese immigrant laborers on the western end and Irish and other laborers on the eastern end. The Chinese workers, who did the most dangerous work, including handling the explosives used to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains, were paid less than their white counterparts, housed separately, and fed different food. When the railroad was complete and the famous Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, the Chinese workers who had built a significant portion of it were not in the photograph. History has a way of cropping certain people out of its official images. But the bodies that built this country cannot be cropped out of the record, even when they are absent from the photographs. They are present in every mile of canal, every mile of track, every cleared field, every harvested crop, every built city. History is lived in bodies, and the bodies that built America deserve to be part of the story we tell about it, not as footnotes, as the foundation. The 19th century, when everything moved at once, there is a particular kind of historical moment when the pace of change accelerates so dramatically that the people living through it can feel the ground shifting beneath their feet in real time. The 19th century in America was one of those moments. And I do not mean that in a vague, general sense. I mean that a person born in rural Virginia in 1800 and living to see 1870 would have witnessed, within a single lifetime, changes so fundamental and so rapid that the world they died in would have been almost unrecognizable to the world they were born into. They would have been born into a country of roughly 5 million people, mostly clustered along the eastern seaboard, moving at the speed of a horse, communicating at the speed of a letter carried by a rider on a muddy road, farming with wooden tools not fundamentally different from those used in ancient times. They would have died in a country of nearly 40 million people, connected by over 50,000 miles of railroad track, communicating by telegraph at the speed of electricity, fighting a war that had just ended that killed more Americans than any other conflict before or since, in a landscape being transformed by machinery and factories, and the first trembling beginnings of industrial urbanization. That is one lifetime. Let us trace how it happened. The first thing to understand about the 19th century transformation of America is that it was driven by several enormous forces operating simultaneously and feeding into each other in ways that nobody fully planned or predicted. The first force was territorial expansion. In 1800, the United States occupied the eastern third of the continent, roughly the land east of the Mississippi River. Within 50 years, through a combination of purchase, negotiation, war, and outright seizure, the country had expanded to the Pacific Ocean. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was perhaps the most significant real estate transaction in history. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing money for his European wars and having lost his Caribbean empire to the Haitian Revolution, sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. This approximately doubled the size of the country overnight. Thomas Jefferson, who authorized the purchase, was not entirely sure it was constitutional, and he was right to wonder, The Constitution did not explicitly give the president the power to acquire new territory. But Jefferson did it anyway, because the opportunity was too large to pass up. Which tells you something about the relationship between principle and opportunity in the lives of even the most principled men. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 was sent to explore this new territory, map its rivers, document its plants and animals, and establish American presence and relationships with the indigenous nations of the interior. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark traveled roughly 8,000 miles and returned with journals full of meticulous observations. They were guided through much of the most difficult terrain by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who was traveling with her husband, a French-Canadian fur trader, and who was carrying an infant for much of the journey. Sacagawea's contribution to the expedition was essential. Her ability to communicate with Western indigenous nations, her knowledge of the terrain, and her very presence, which signaled to other tribes that the expedition was not a war party, since war parties did not travel with women and children, were all critical. She was paid nothing for this. Her husband was paid. She was not. The expansion continued through the following decades. The War of 1812 with Britain was partly a land war, with American ambitions to absorb Canada playing a significant role alongside the stated grievances about naval rights and impressment of sailors. That ambition failed. Canada remained British. But the war ended with a renewed American sense of national identity and the beginning of a period of intense westward pressure. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Andrew Jackson, authorized the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, from their homelands in the southeastern United States to territory west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee had done everything the American government had previously suggested they do to be accepted as a civilized nation. They had adopted a written constitution modeled on the American one. They had established farms, schools, and newspapers. They had a syllabary, a writing system developed by a Cherokee scholar named Sequoyah that allowed widespread literacy in the Cherokee language. Within a remarkably short time, none of it mattered. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land in Georgia in 1829 had made their removal economically attractive to white settlers and politically popular with the Georgia state government. Jackson, who had built much of his political reputation on Indian fighting, was happy to oblige. The resulting forced march, which the Cherokee call Nunadal Tsuni, or the Trail Where They Cried, and which history records as the Trail of Tears, killed somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee people out of a population of roughly 16,000 who made the journey. People died of cold, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. They were marched in winter through inadequate clothing. They were held in internment camps before the march, where disease spread rapidly. They were guarded by soldiers who were sometimes indifferent and sometimes actively cruel. This was not a side event in American history. This was policy, deliberate, legal, signed by the President of the United States. The second great force reshaping 19th century America was industrialization. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 18th century, arrived in America in the early 19th century and transformed the economy and the landscape with gathering speed. The first American textile mills appeared in New England in the 1790s. By the 1820s and 1830s, the mill towns of Massachusetts and Rhode Island were drawing young women from rural New England farms to work in factories, living in company boarding houses, working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that were modest but represented a degree of economic independence that had not previously been available to them. The Lowell Mill Girls, as they were called, are a fascinating chapter in American labor and women's history. They were not simply passive victims of industrial capitalism, though the conditions they worked in were genuinely hard. They organized, they protested wage cuts, they published literary magazines, they corresponded with each other about books and ideas and the meaning of their new circumstances. And when wages were cut and conditions deteriorated in the 1840s, many of them left, replaced by waves of Irish immigrants fleeing the catastrophic famine that struck Ireland between 1845 and 1852. The Irish famine, which killed approximately 1 million people and drove another million to emigrate within its first 5 years, transformed the ethnic composition of American cities. Irish immigrants arrived in massive numbers, desperately poor, widely discriminated against, settled in the worst neighborhoods, took the hardest and most dangerous jobs, and were met with a hostility that sometimes turned violent. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" were common in employment listings. The anti-Irish, anti-Catholic prejudice of mid-19th century America was intense and institutionalized. And yet the Irish came anyway, because the alternative was starvation. This pattern, desperate arrival, discrimination, slow and painful integration, is one that would repeat itself with virtually every subsequent wave of immigration throughout American history. The Irish were followed by Germans, then Scandinavians, then Italians, Poles and Jews from Eastern Europe, then Chinese and Japanese on the West Coast, then Mexicans and Latin Americans, then people from every corner of the globe. Each new group faced the suspicion and hostility that had been directed at those who came before. Each group was told, in various ways, that they were not quite American enough, and each group, over time, became part of the complicated, layered, never fully resolved American identity. The third force was the one that tore the country apart: slavery. The tension between the slave states and the free states had been present from the very founding of the Republic. It had been managed, papered over, compromised around, and deferred for decades by a series of political arrangements that simply postponed the confrontation rather than resolving it. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened previously settled territories to the possibility of slavery through popular vote, and triggered a period of violent conflict in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, so intense that it was called Bleeding Kansas. The conflict was not only moral, though it was deeply moral. It was economic and political. The slave economy of the South and the emerging industrial economy of the North were developing in increasingly incompatible directions. The South wanted access to Western territories for the expansion of the plantation system. The North, and particularly the growing free labor political movement, wanted those territories for free white settlers who would build the kind of small farm, free labor economy that Northern politicians were promoting. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform that did not call for the abolition of slavery where it already existed, but did call for preventing its expansion into new territories, was enough to push the Southern states to secession. South Carolina left first in December 1860, before Lincoln had even been inaugurated. 10 more states followed. The Civil War that began in April 1861 was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Approximately 620,000 to 750 Sioux soldiers died, though more recent scholarship suggests the number may be closer to 850,000. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other American wars combined. The dead came from both sides, from every class and background, from farms and cities, from families that were torn apart by the conflict in ways that lasted for generations. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, which Lincoln issued as a war measure, declared enslaved people in the Confederate States to be free. It did not free enslaved people in the border states that had remained in the Union, a limitation that reflected the political calculations Lincoln was navigating, but it transformed the moral character of the war and opened the door to the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Nearly 180 black men served in the Union Army and Navy. They fought in segregated units under mostly white officers, were paid less than white soldiers, and faced the specific danger that if captured, they might be killed or re-enslaved, rather than treated as prisoners of war. The war ended in April 1865, with Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington and died the following morning. The period that followed, called Reconstruction, was a genuine attempt to rebuild the South on the basis of racial equality and to integrate formerly enslaved people into the political and economic life of the country. Black men voted and held office. Schools were built, churches were established, families reunited after decades of forced separation. Constitutional amendments were passed guaranteeing citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights. And then, gradually and then decisively, it was dismantled. Through a combination of violence, political deal-making, and legal maneuvering, the gains of Reconstruction were rolled back state by state through the 1870s and 1880s. The Supreme Court weakened the enforcement of the Reconstruction Amendments. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism to suppress black political participation. By the end of the 19th century, the former Confederate states had erected a comprehensive system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement, backed by law and by violence, that would remain in place for nearly a century. The world had changed around slavery. Slavery had been abolished, but the structures of racial hierarchy that slavery had built were reconstructed in new forms, durable forms, forms that proved extraordinarily resistant to dismantling. That is the story of the 19th century in America. A century of enormous change that left certain things, fundamental things, stubbornly, deliberately unchanged. How Hollywood, tourism, and the internet taught you the wrong version. At some point in the 20th century, American history stopped being just history and became a product. And like most products, it was redesigned to be more appealing to the customer. The rough edges were sanded down. The uncomfortable parts were moved to smaller rooms or simply left off the tour entirely. The heroes became more heroic. The villains became more cartoonishly villainous so that the heroes could look better by comparison. The stories became cleaner, faster, more satisfying, and considerably less true. This is not an accident. It is not a conspiracy exactly. It is the entirely predictable result of history being filtered through commercial entertainment, political interest, and a genuine human desire for stories that feel good, rather than stories that feel complicated. Let us go through some of the most widespread and most consequential modern distortions of American history, and I want to do this with a certain amount of affection, because some of these myths are genuinely charming, and it is a little sad to let them go. Let us start with the cowboys. The image of the American cowboy is one of the most globally recognized cultural exports in history. The lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against a wide western sky, self-reliant, quietly heroic, the embodiment of American freedom and rugged individualism. Hollywood built an entire genre around this image. Hundreds of films, decades of television. The cowboy as American archetype. The reality of the historical cowboy is considerably more interesting and considerably less cinematic. The era of the great cattle drives that gave rise to the cowboy myth lasted roughly from about 1867 to 1886, less than 20 years. It ended not because the frontier was won, but because the expansion of the railroad network made the long cattle drives economically unnecessary, and because the severe winter of 1886 to 1887 killed enormous numbers of cattle and broke the open-range cattle industry. The actual cowboys of that era were a remarkably diverse group. Historians estimate that somewhere between a quarter and a third of all working cowboys in the cattle drive era were black men, many of them formerly enslaved, who found that the cattle industry offered work and a degree of freedom from the racial violence that was escalating in the post-Reconstruction South. There were also significant numbers of Mexican vaqueros, who had actually developed most of the skills and equipment that Anglo cowboys adopted: the roping techniques, the saddle designs, the chaps, the lasso, the terminology. The word lasso comes from the Spanish lazo. The word ranch comes from the Spanish rancho. The word bronco comes from the Spanish for rough or crude. The Hollywood cowboy is almost invariably white, almost invariably taciturn and individualistic, almost invariably operating in a landscape empty of anyone except a few outlaws, and perhaps a town full of grateful settlers. The historical cowboy was often part of a highly interdependent crew, working for wages, frequently in debt, living a life that was physically punishing, financially precarious, and far less glamorous than the myth suggests. None of that makes for a very satisfying movie poster, so the myth persisted and the reality faded. Now let us talk about something closer to the schoolroom. The myth of Christopher Columbus as a heroic, visionary, misunderstood explorer sailing bravely against the doubts of ignorant people who believed the earth was flat. Here is the thing about the flat earth part. Educated Europeans in 1492 did not believe the earth was flat. They had not believed that for over 1,000 years. The ancient Greek mathematician Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC. Medieval European scholars knew the earth was spherical. This was not a controversial position in Columbus's time. The actual disagreement between Columbus and the scholars who reviewed his proposal was about the size of the earth. Columbus believed the earth was significantly smaller than it actually is, and therefore that Asia was reachable across the Atlantic within a reasonable sailing distance. The scholars who doubted him were correct. If the Americas had not been in the way, Columbus's ships would have run out of supplies and sunk somewhere in the open Pacific Ocean. He reached the Americas not because of his superior vision, but because he was lucky enough to find a continent where his incorrect calculations told him Asia should be. Columbus also did not prove the earth was round. He proved that there was something large in the western Atlantic, which turned out not to be what he thought it was. He died believing he had reached Asia. He went to his grave wrong about what he had found. The flat earth myth was largely invented by the American writer Washington Irving, best known for the legend of Sleepy Hollow, in an 1828 biography of Columbus that took considerable fictional liberties with the historical record. The flat earth story made Columbus's achievement seem more dramatic. It was, in the technical sense, made up, and it has proven almost impossible to dislodge from popular understanding despite being definitively contradicted by the historical record. That is the power of a good story. Now, the Civil War. The modern distortion of the Civil War is perhaps the most consequential historical myth in American life because it is not just an intellectual error. It has political and social effects that are still very much active. The myth I am referring to is sometimes called the lost cause. It is the interpretation of the Civil War that frames the Confederate cause as being about states' rights and Southern heritage rather than about slavery. It portrays Confederate soldiers as noble, chivalric figures fighting for their homeland against Northern aggression. It suggests that slavery was a secondary or peripheral issue rather than the central cause of the conflict. This interpretation was largely constructed after the war, beginning in the 1870s and 1880s by Confederate veterans, politicians, and writers who were attempting to rehabilitate the Confederate cause and resist the moral implications of having fought to preserve slavery. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy were enormously influential in shaping how the Civil War was taught in Southern schools for generations. They lobbied for textbooks that promoted the lost cause interpretation. They funded the construction of Confederate monuments, many of which were erected not immediately after the war, but during the height of the Jim Crow era in the early 20th century, and again during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The timing of those monument dedications is revealing. The historical record on the cause of the Civil War is not actually ambiguous. The secession documents of the Confederate States state clearly and explicitly that the preservation of slavery is the primary reason for secession. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a speech in March 1861 called the Cornerstone Speech, in which he stated that slavery and the inequality of the races was the cornerstone of the Confederacy and the foundation of its new government. These are not interpretations. These are primary sources written by the people involved at the time, and yet the lost cause interpretation persisted in popular culture, in school textbooks, in political rhetoric, and in the landscape of monuments for over a century. It shaped how multiple generations of Americans understood what the war had been about, and therefore what its legacy meant for the present. Let us shift now to something a little lighter, though not entirely innocent: the American frontier myth as delivered by Hollywood. The Western film genre created an image of the frontier as a place of dramatic individual confrontation, of good guys and bad guys, of civilization bravely advancing against wilderness. It was almost entirely told from the perspective of white settlers, and almost entirely portrayed Native American people as obstacles, threats, or at best colorful background figures. This was not just historical inaccuracy. It was active myth-making in service of a particular political vision. The idea that the West was empty, that it was there to be taken, that the people already living there were uncivilized and therefore their dispossession was natural or even heroic, was not simply a movie trope. It was a justification for what had actually happened, and the repetition of that justification through decades of popular entertainment helped it become common sense rather than recognized as the specific ideological position it was. The internet has added new layers to historical distortion. Social media circulates historical myths and misattributed quotes at tremendous speed. Founding fathers are regularly credited with things they never said. Historical photographs are misidentified and shared millions of times before. Corrections circulate to a fraction of that audience. The map of popular historical understanding is being redrawn constantly by platforms whose algorithms reward emotional engagement rather than accuracy. And here is the irony that I find genuinely interesting. We live in an era of unprecedented access to historical information. Primary sources that previously required a visit to a specialized archive are now available online. Digitized newspapers, court records, census data, letters, diaries, all of it increasingly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. We have never had easier access to historical truth, and yet the myths persist. In some cases, they are spreading faster than ever. Because myths are not primarily about what people know, they are about what people need. The cowboy myth served a need for a story of heroic American individualism. The Columbus flat earth myth served a need for a story of visionary genius triumphing over ignorant opposition. The lost cause myth served a need to make an unjust cause seem noble and to resist the moral reckoning that acknowledging the truth would require. Understanding why people need particular myths is not the same as accepting those myths as true, but it is essential to understanding why they are so persistent and why correcting them requires more than simply presenting accurate information. The facts help. They genuinely help, but the story around the facts matters just as much, which is, in a roundabout way, exactly what we are doing here tonight. Telling the story more honestly, and trusting that the honest story, with all its mess and contradiction and genuine human complexity, is more interesting anyway, because it really is. Here is a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Why is there still a United States of America? Not in a political science textbook sense, in a genuinely curious, historically grounded sense. Because if you look at what this country has been through, the list of moments at which it could have collapsed, fragmented, dissolved, or transformed beyond recognition is genuinely long. It almost did not survive its own founding. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing document of the United States, created a central government so weak that it could not collect taxes, could not enforce its own laws, could not pay its war debts, and could not prevent individual states from essentially acting as independent nations. By the late 1780s, the American experiment was in serious danger of simply falling apart before it had properly begun. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was convened partly out of genuine alarm that the country was not going to hold together. It almost did not survive the War of 1812, during which British forces sailed up the Potomac River and burned the White House and the Capitol building. The president had to flee. The city was in flames. The National Archives were saved only because a State Department clerk named Stephen Pleasanton had the presence of mind to pack the most important documents into linen bags and cart them out of the city in a wagon. It almost did not survive the Civil War, which came closer to permanently fracturing the country than almost any other event in its history. The Union's military situation looked genuinely dire for significant stretches of the war. There were moments when a Confederate victory seemed plausible, and a Confederate victory would have meant the permanent division of the continent into at least two separate nations. It survived the Great Depression of the 1930s, when unemployment reached 25%, when banks failed by the thousands, when hundreds of thousands of families lost their farms and homes and savings, when a significant portion of the population was hungry in one of the richest countries on earth, when political movements of both the far left and the far right were gaining strength in ways that alarmed many observers of what was happening simultaneously in Europe. So why did it survive all of these? The honest answer is not a single clean explanation. It is a combination of factors, some of them principled, some of them pragmatic, some of them frankly lucky, and understanding that combination is one of the most illuminating things you can do with American history. The first factor is flexibility. The constitutional system of the United States, for all its flaws and limitations, built in mechanisms for adaptation that have proven remarkably durable. The amendment process allowed the document to change without requiring the entire system to be scrapped and rebuilt. The federal structure allowed for enormous variation in how different parts of the country organized themselves while maintaining a shared national framework. The separation of powers, while it creates friction and inefficiency, also means that no single bad actor can easily take control of the entire apparatus of government. This flexibility was tested constantly and remains imperfect. But compared to the political systems of most countries over the same time period, the American constitutional framework has shown an unusual capacity to absorb pressure and adjust without catastrophic collapse. The second factor is economics. The United States has been, for most of its history, an extraordinarily resource-rich country. The agricultural potential of the land is enormous. The mineral wealth, coal, iron, oil, copper, gold, silver is vast. The geographic position, bordered by 2 oceans and 2 relatively stable neighbors, provided both security and access to global trade in a way that few countries have enjoyed. This does not mean the economic history is a simple success story. It is not. It is full of exploitation, inequality, speculation, collapse, and the systematic extraction of wealth from the many to concentrate it in the hands of the few. But the underlying resource base meant that even after serious economic disasters, there was enough material foundation to rebuild from. The third factor is immigration. This one is worth spending a moment on, because it is both genuinely important and genuinely complicated. Throughout its history, the United States has received waves of immigrants who brought skills, labor, ideas, cultural energy, and a particular kind of motivated ambition that comes from having left everything familiar behind and needing to make something work in a new place. The immigrants who built the canals and railroads, who staffed the factories and the farms, who opened the small businesses and the law offices and the medical practices, who fought in the wars and paid the taxes and raised the children who became the next generation of Americans, were an enormous source of national vitality. The diversity of backgrounds and perspectives that immigration created also, over time, produced a cultural creativity and adaptability that has been one of the most distinctive features of American life. This is not a story without shadow. Immigrants were exploited, discriminated against, excluded. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major federal law to restrict immigration on the basis of race and nationality. The immigration restrictions of the 1920s were explicitly designed to reduce the flow of people from Southern and Eastern Europe and to prevent almost all immigration from Asia. Japanese Americans were interned in camps during World War II, their property confiscated, their loyalty presumed absent on the basis of their ancestry alone. The history of immigration in America is a history of the country simultaneously, depending on newcomers and resenting them, welcoming them and excluding them, assimilating them and discriminating against them, in a cycle that has repeated itself with every new group and shows no signs of ending. And yet, the country kept absorbing new people and being changed by them, and the new people kept arriving and being changed by it, and that mutual transformation, difficult and contested as it always was, kept producing something that was neither the old country the immigrants left, nor a simple continuation of what came before. It kept producing something new. The fourth factor is shared meaning. Nations do not hold together through laws alone. They hold together through shared stories, shared symbols, shared rituals, and a shared belief, however complicated and contested, that being part of this particular community means something. The American founding documents, imperfect and contradictory as they are, provided a framework of shared meaning that proved remarkably durable. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, became a standard that people could invoke against the country's own failures. It became a tool of aspiration as much as a record of achievement. Every movement for justice in American history, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor organizers, the civil rights movement, has reached back to those founding ideals and used them as leverage against the gap between promise and reality. This is one of the stranger features of American political culture. The founding documents are simultaneously a source of genuine inspiration and a source of genuine frustration. They set a standard that the country has never fully met, and the distance between the standard and the reality has been both a cause of suffering and a driver of change. The fifth factor, and perhaps the most human one, is stubbornness. Not the political kind, though there is plenty of that. The ordinary human stubbornness of people who decided that they were going to make something work and refused to stop trying even when the odds were poor. The farmers who kept planting after their crops failed. The workers who kept organizing after their unions were broken up. The voters who kept showing up after their voting rights were suppressed. The soldiers who kept fighting in wars that made very little sense to them. The immigrants who kept building lives in places that did not always want them. The parents who kept believing that their children's lives would be better than their own. That particular stubbornness, that insistence on continuing, on trying, on refusing to accept that the present moment is the final word on what is possible, is woven through American history in a way that is genuinely moving if you let yourself see it clearly. It is not enough on its own. Stubbornness without justice is just persistence in the wrong direction, and American history has plenty of examples of people stubbornly persisting in wrong directions with tremendous energy and conviction. But the stubbornness in service of something better, the kind that shows up in the long arc of American reform movements, in the slow and painful expansion of who gets included in the promises of the founding documents, that kind of stubbornness is one of the genuinely admirable features of the national story. The United States survived because it was flexible enough to adapt, rich enough to recover, diverse enough to replenish itself, and idealistic enough to hold itself to a standard it could never quite reach, but could never quite abandon either. That is not a perfect formula, but it turns out, in the long and messy business of building a country, perfect formulas are not what you need. What you need is enough flexibility, enough resources, enough people willing to keep trying. And so far, through everything, there has been just barely enough. What this whole long story reveals about being human. We are 3 hours into this now. 3 hours of walking through ice and forests and cities and wars and compromises and failures and stubborn human persistence. 3 hours of bodies and beliefs and documents and decisions. 3 hours of trying to see American history not as a parade of monuments, but as a collection of human beings, each one trying to navigate the specific circumstances they were born into, each one making choices that seemed reasonable to them at the time. Each one carrying hopes and fears that were, in the end, not so different from the ones we carry now. And if you sit with all of that long enough, if you let it settle into something quieter than argument or judgment or pride or shame, something starts to emerge, a pattern, a truth, something about what it means to be human, that this particular story, this specific unfolding of events on this specific piece of land, reveals with unusual clarity. Here is what I think that truth is. Human beings are capable of holding contradictions inside themselves with almost no limit. Not just in the sense that people are complicated, though they are, in the sense that people can genuinely, sincerely believe in ideals that their own actions directly violate. And they can do this not because they are hypocrites, though some of them are, but because they have constructed elaborate mental frameworks that allow them to believe that the contradiction is not actually a contradiction at all. Thomas Jefferson could write that all men are created equal and own hundreds of enslaved people, and father children with Sally Hemings, a woman he owned, and understand himself to be a man of principle. Not because he was stupid or evil, though owning people is certainly evil, but because he had convinced himself through layers of reasoning and rationalization and the accepted wisdom of his class and time that the contradiction was reconcilable. The Puritan settlers of New England could believe passionately in religious freedom for themselves, and then exile, punish, or execute people who practice different forms of Christianity or different faiths entirely, not because they were insincere in their belief in freedom, but because their understanding of freedom was specific and bounded in ways that excluded the very thing we now call religious tolerance. The same country that fought a war for independence, based on the principle that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, could spend the next century displacing, removing, and killing indigenous peoples without full acknowledgement of the profound contradiction between those two positions. Not because Americans were uniquely cruel, though cruelty was certainly present, but because they had created a framework in which indigenous peoples were defined as fundamentally outside the political community to which those principles applied. This is not unique to America. This is a human pattern, but American history, because it is so explicitly founded on written principles, on declared ideals, makes the gap between principle and practice unusually visible. And that visibility is valuable because it forces a confrontation with the reality that ideals alone are not enough. Ideals have to be fought for. They have to be expanded. They have to be defended against the very people who claim to hold them. And that fight is never finished, because each generation finds new ways to limit who deserves dignity and freedom, new categories of exclusion, new justifications for treating some people as less than fully human. Here is another human truth that American history reveals. Progress is not inevitable. It is also not impossible. There is a temptation, when looking at history, to believe that it moves in a single direction, that things naturally get better over time, that the arc of history bends toward justice, as Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, quoting a 19th century abolitionist minister named Theodore Parker. But that phrase, beautiful as it is incomplete if you do not sit with the word bends. Bending requires force. Bending requires effort. The arc does not move on its own. It is moved by people who push it, often at great personal cost, often without seeing the results of their work in their own lifetimes. Slavery was not abolished because it naturally faded away. It was abolished because abolitionists, black and white, free and formerly enslaved, spent decades organizing, writing, speaking, resisting, running the Underground Railroad, pressuring politicians, and ultimately fighting a war that killed more than 500,000 people. And even then, the formal abolition of slavery did not end the systems of racial oppression that slavery had created. Those systems were reconstructed in new forms that required another century of struggle to begin to dismantle. Women did not gain the right to vote because men suddenly realized it was the right thing to do. They gained it because generations of suffragists organized, marched, petitioned, went to jail, were force-fed when they went on hunger strikes, faced ridicule and violence, and kept pushing until the political cost of continuing to exclude them became too high. Workers did not gain the 8-hour workday and basic labor protections because employers generously decided to improve conditions. They gained them because labor organizers, many of whom were beaten, jailed, and killed for their efforts, built unions and went on strike and forced the issue through collective action. Progress happens because people make it happen, and it is always opposed, and the opposition is always well-funded, well-organized, and convinced of its own righteousness. Here is a third truth. Memory is a battleground. Who gets remembered and who gets forgotten is not a neutral process. It is a political process. The monuments that get built, the names that go on the buildings, the stories that get taught in schools, the holidays that get celebrated, all of these are choices made by people with power about whose version of the past should be preserved and whose should be allowed to fade. For most of American history, the version of the past that was preserved and celebrated was the one that served the interests of the people who had the power to build monuments and write textbooks. The contributions of women were minimized or ignored. The contributions of Black Americans were minimized or ignored. The contributions of indigenous peoples were minimized or ignored. The contributions of workers and immigrants and everyone who was not part of the political and economic elite were treated as background rather than as central to the story. Recovering those erased or minimized contributions is not a matter of being politically correct. It is a matter of telling the truth. And it matters because the stories a society tells about its past shape how it thinks about its present and its future. If the story you grow up with is that America was built by great men making great decisions, then the present looks like it should be shaped by great men making great decisions, and everyone else's role is to get out of the way or applaud. If the story you grow up with is that America was built by millions of ordinary people doing difficult work and fighting for recognition and inclusion in the face of powerful opposition, then the present looks very different. It looks like a place where your voice and your effort might actually matter. Both stories have evidence to support them, but they lead to very different ideas about what democracy is and who it is for. Here is a fourth truth, and this one is harder to articulate, but I think it is important. Human beings need belonging, and the need for belonging is so strong that it can override almost every other consideration, including moral clarity, including self-interest, including truth. The pull of community, of identity, of being part of something larger than yourself, is one of the most powerful forces in human life, and it is not inherently good or bad. It is simply powerful. It can drive people to extraordinary acts of courage and solidarity and self-sacrifice. It can also drive people to exclusion, violence, and the dehumanization of anyone defined as outside the community. American history is full of both. The intense local solidarity of small New England towns in the colonial period created genuine mutual support, and also created brutal conformity, the punishment of anyone who did not fit the community's expectations. The solidarity of labor unions created collective bargaining power that improved the lives of millions of workers, and also sometimes excluded black workers and women from membership. The solidarity of ethnic communities helped immigrants survive in a hostile new country and also sometimes created suspicion and hostility toward other immigrant groups. Belonging is complicated, and part of what makes American history so endlessly fascinating and frustrating is that it is a story of constantly negotiating who belongs, on what terms, and what belonging means. The American experiment, at its best, is an attempt to create a form of belonging that is based not on blood or religion or ethnicity, but on shared commitment to a set of ideals. That is a genuinely radical idea, and it has never been fully realized. And the gap between the ideal and the reality is where most of American political conflict lives. Here is the last truth I want to offer, and then we are going to start slowing down and moving towards sleep. History does not repeat itself, but it does echo. The specific circumstances of the past are never identical to the present, but the patterns, the human dynamics, the ways that fear and hope and power and resistance interact, those repeat with remarkable consistency. Every generation thinks it is facing unprecedented challenges, and in the specific details, it is. But in the broader patterns, most of what looks unprecedented has actually happened before in different clothes. The fear of immigrants changing the character of the country, the tension between federal authority and state autonomy, the conflict between economic interests and environmental sustainability, the question of who deserves full participation in political life and who can be excluded, the struggle over whose version of history should be taught and remembered. All of these have been contested issues throughout American history, and all of them are contested today. Understanding that does not make the present easier, but it does provide some perspective. It reminds you that you are not the first person to face these questions, and it allows you to learn from how previous generations navigated them, both their successes and their failures. The big human truth that American history reveals is this: we are all, every one of us, trying to build something decent and livable out of circumstances we did not choose, with tools that are never quite adequate, in the company of other people who want different things and see the world differently. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail, sometimes we build something remarkable and then watch it collapse or be torn down. Sometimes we think we have failed and then discover that what we built outlasted us and became the foundation for something we never imagined. History is not a story with a single meaning or a clear moral. It is a record of what human beings have done with the time and place and circumstances they were given. And the meaning you take from it depends on what you are looking for and what you need it to teach you. For me, Tonight, what I take from it is a kind of stubborn, qualified hope. Not optimism, which is too light a word and too certain, hope. The sense that, despite everything, despite the long catalog of failures and betrayals and missed opportunities, people keep trying to make things better. They keep reaching for ideals that they know they might not achieve. They keep insisting that the gap between what is and what should be matters and is worth fighting over. That is a deeply human thing, maybe the most human thing there is. And American history, with all its contradictions and complications, is full of it, full of people trying, which is, in the end, the best any of us can do. Letting history settle, like dust after a long journey. You have been listening for a long time now, 3 hours more or less. 3 hours of names and dates and battles and laws and movements and contradictions. 3 hours of trying to hold a very large, very complicated story in your mind all at once, knowing that even 3 hours is not enough to tell it all. Knowing that every chapter we walked through could be its own series of nights, its own slow unfolding, and that is all right, because history is not something you finish. It is something you return to, again and again, each time noticing something new, each time the light falling a little differently on the same events, revealing details you missed before. Let yourself rest now. Let the details fade a little. You do not need to hold on to all of them. They will be there tomorrow if you want to come back. The broad shape of the story, the long arc from ice and footprints to cities and industry, and all the human struggle in between, that shape will stay with you even as the specific names and dates drift away into sleep. There is something calming about history, if you let it be calming, not the urgent, argumentative version, the other version, the one that reminds you that everything you are worried about tonight, everything that feels enormous and immediate and unprecedented, is part of a much longer story, a story that has survived wars and depressions and pandemics and political upheavals, and is still, somehow, continuing. That does not make your worries less real, but it does put them in context. It reminds you that other people have carried similar worries before you, and some of them found ways forward, and some of their ways forward became the ground you are standing on now. Think about the people we talked about tonight, the ones whose names you know, and the ones whose names were never recorded, the ones who made decisions that changed the course of nations, and the ones who simply woke up each morning and did the work in front of them, day after day, until the work was done, or until they could not do it anymore. They are all part of the same fabric, the famous and the forgotten, the heroic and the ordinary, the people who got monuments and the people who got nothing but tired. And all of them, every single one, lived one day at a time, the same way you do. They woke up in the morning, which is harder some days than others. They worried about things they could not control. They loved people who sometimes disappointed them. They hoped for futures they would not live to see. They tried to make sense of circumstances that often made very little sense. They did their best, which was sometimes good enough and sometimes not. They were human. Fully, completely, complicatedly human, and so are you. There is a kind of companionship in that across the centuries. A quiet recognition that the people in the history books, the ones who seem so distant and formal in the old photographs, were actually just people, tired people, worried people, people trying to figure it out, just like you. Let that thought settle for a moment. You are part of this same long story, not a spectator, a participant. The decisions you make, small as they might seem, the way you treat the people around you, the things you choose to pay attention to, the moments when you decide to speak up or stay quiet, to help or to look away, all of that is part of the ongoing story of the place you live and the time you live in. History is not something that happened to other people in the past. It is something that is happening now, to you, around you, through you, and that is both a weight and a gift. A weight because it means your choices matter, even when it does not feel like they do. A gift because it means you are connected to something much larger and longer than your own single life. You are part of the continuation. Breathe that in for a moment, slowly. Let your breath settle into a rhythm in and out, slow and steady, the same way people have breathed through every moment of the story we just walked through together. Through the cold colonial winters, through the tense nights before battles, through the quiet hours of uncertain waiting, through the celebrations and the grief and the ordinary Tuesdays that make up most of life. In and out, people have been breathing through history the whole time, and so are you. Let the room around you fade a little now. Let the details soften. You do not need to be alert anymore. You do not need to hold on to every fact. The story is not going anywhere. It will be here tomorrow, and the day after that. And for as long as people are curious about where they came from and how they got here, you can let go now. Let your body sink into wherever you are lying. Let the weight of the day, the weight of everything you have been carrying, settle down into the bed or the couch or wherever you have found to rest. You have been holding a lot. You can put it down for a while. Think about fields at dusk. The particular quality of light just after the sun has set, but before the dark has fully arrived. That soft, quiet, in-between time, that is where we are now, between waking and sleeping, between thought and rest, between holding on and letting go. And in that in-between space, history feels different, less like a list of things you are supposed to remember, and more like a long, slow river, moving from somewhere far away towards somewhere you cannot quite see. And you are floating in it, not fighting it, not trying to direct it, just floating, being carried, letting the current do what currents do. The people we talked about tonight are in that river too, somewhere upstream, their lives already lived, their decisions already made, their stories already part of the water that is carrying you now. And somewhere downstream, people you will never meet are floating too. People who will tell stories about this moment the same way we tell stories about the past. People who will wonder what you were thinking, what you were hoping for, what you did with the time you were given. But that is not something you need to think about right now. Right now, you just need to float. Let the water hold you. Let the rhythm of it, the gentle movement, the soft sound of time passing like water over stones, let all of that carry you into sleep. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember in this exact moment. The story will still be there in the morning. The world will still be turning. The long arc of history will still be bending, slowly, pushed by hands you will never see, toward destinations no one can fully predict. But tonight, right now, none of that is your responsibility. Your only responsibility is to rest, to let your mind slow down, to let your thoughts drift like leaves on the surface of water, to let yourself slip gently into the quiet dark space where sleep lives. And if you wake up in a few hours and want to listen again, that is fine. The story will start over. The ice will still be there at the beginning. The footprints will still be crossing the frozen land. The whole long, complicated, beautiful, difficult story will still be waiting. But for now, for right now, just sleep, where the story rests until morning. When you wake up tomorrow, the United States will still be here, not perfect, not finished, not resolved into a simple story with a clean ending, but here, still trying. Still full of people who disagree about almost everything, and still, somehow, share the same land, the same laws, the same complicated inheritance. And that is worth noticing quietly as you drift. The country that started with ice and footprints, and people simply trying to survive the winter. The country that was built by so many hands, some of them free, some of them enslaved, some of them paid, some of them not, all of them human, all of them leaving marks on the landscape that are still visible if you know where to look. The country that declared bold ideals, and then spent centuries arguing about who those ideals applied to, and what they actually meant in practice. The country that fought a war with itself, and somehow stitched itself back together, imperfectly, incompletely, but together nonetheless. The country that people left everything behind to come to, hoping for something better, and that sometimes delivered on that hope and sometimes betrayed it. And that was, always, more complicated than the stories they had been told before they arrived. The country that you live in now, that you are part of, that is still being written, still being argued over, still being shaped by decisions made every day by people who mostly do not think of themselves as shaping history but are doing it anyway, simply by living, by choosing, by trying. You are part of that. And tomorrow when you wake up, you will step back into it, back into the ongoing unfinished story, back into the noise and the arguments and the daily work of living in a particular place at a particular time with particular people. But tonight you do not have to carry any of it. Tonight, history can rest. And so can you. Think about dawn, if you want to think about anything. The quiet moment just before the sun rises, when the air is still and cool and the world feels like it is holding its breath. That moment when night is ending but day has not quite begun. That soft, suspended, peaceful moment. That is where we are going to leave the story tonight. In that quiet space between darkness and light, between the long walk through the past and the step into tomorrow, between remembering and forgetting, between holding on and letting go, the story of America is a human story, full of contradiction and courage and failure and persistence, full of people trying to build something decent in the face of forces that made it difficult, full of hope that was sometimes rewarded and sometimes betrayed, but that somehow, against all odds, kept showing up anyway. And the most remarkable thing about it, the thing that I hope you take with you into sleep, is that it is not finished. The people we talked about tonight, the ones who cleared the forests and wrote the documents and fought the wars and built the cities and demanded justice and were denied it and demanded it again. Anyway, they were writing chapters, and you are too. Your chapter might not be in the history books. Most chapters are not. But that does not mean they do not matter. Every quiet decision to be kind when you could be cruel. Every moment when you choose to pay attention instead of looking away. Every time you speak up for someone who cannot speak for themselves. Every time you teach a child something true. Every time you build something, anything, that makes the world a little more livable for the people who come after you. All of that is history. Small history, human history, the kind that does not get monuments but that holds the world together anyway. So rest now, knowing that you are part of something much larger than yourself, knowing that the story you are living is connected to all the stories that came before and all the stories that will come after, knowing that your life, ordinary and unremarkable as it might feel most days, is a thread in a fabric that stretches across centuries. That is not a burden, that is a gift. Let your eyes close now if they have not already. Let the darkness be soft and welcoming. Let the pillow hold your head. Let the blanket hold the warmth of your body. Let the quiet of the night settle around you, like water around a stone. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. You have walked through 3 hours of history, through ice and colonies and revolutions and wars and movements and migrations and all the long, slow work of building a country out of hope and fear and accident and intention. You have done enough. The story will be here tomorrow. The country will be here tomorrow. The questions will be here tomorrow. But tonight, you can rest. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let history settle into the past where it belongs. And let yourself settle into sleep. The long work of being human will still be there in the morning. But for now, for these next few quiet hours, you can simply be still, quiet, at rest. Good night.